Welcome, everyone. My name's John Seigenthaler. I'm a former journalist at NBC News and MSNBC and Al Jazeera, and I now work for Finn Partners as a managing partner here in Nashville. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and we've got some great panelists to have, I think, a very interesting discussion about trust and about censorship. Let me introduce them. At the far end is James Bennet. He's the senior editor at The Economist. Inaya, Folarin, Iman is a journalist and executive director of the Equiano project. Ritu, Kapur is a CEO and co-founder of the Quint, a digital outlet in India. And David Plazas is the opinion and engagement director at the Tennessean. Welcome to all of you. Good to see you. James, let me just start with you. A Gallup poll out this week that suggests that the trend of mistrust of media continues, that fewer people trust the media in the United States. This is a trend that's been going on for a long time. Why?
First of all, it's lovely to be with everybody.
Thank you.
And, it's great to be here. There are lots of reasons we know that distrust has declined in the media. My view is it's fine for people not to trust the media and to approach it with skepticism, and I think the media needs to do a much better job of trying to earn that trust back. I think the media has forfeited a lot of trust. The legacy media in the United States, partly because I think, and this was alluded to earlier on another panel, I think the media kind of lost trust in its readership and to some extent hasn't been willing to expose people to inconvenient facts or opinions that they might find unsettling. Has not served as the bulwark of self-government that it's supposed to be, and doesn't play the role it's supposed to play, which is not to tell people what to think, but to help people think for themselves. And so, from my view, the media has a lot of work to do on its own, on its own part, to try to win the trust, to try to win trust back.
Why didn't the media do that, and what can they do to begin to build trust?
Well, I think part of it is the culture that was discussed earlier. David French blamed Gen X for the way it raised its kids as being the source of the problem. I do think it is partly the set of ideas that percolated in the academy for a long time and then got loose over the course of the last 15 years. The idea of safetyism, and increasingly the idea that the notion that certain ideas are dangerous to share. That's what I mean by losing trust in the public, that it's dangerous to expose people to certain ideas because you don't know what they'll do with it. I think the opposite is true, that it's dangerous to try to suppress or hide those ideas because it makes them taboo. And Salman Rushdie talked about this morning, and therefore makes them sexier and more glamorous. And I think traditionally, in my view, the press, this is less of a free speech issue and more of a cultural, narrow issue, is sort of the vanguard of the liberal idea. The traditional values of curiosity, empathy, drove the press to not hide those sorts of ideas, but to sort of revel in bringing them to the public, and that's the spirit that I think we need to recapture.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about the Equiano project and why and the state of trust in the UK and in Europe these days?
Yeah, so I think just touching upon the previous point, I think that particularly over the last 10 years, essentially the definition of freedom of speech changed from that kind of liberal John Stuart Mill conception that many of us have become very familiar with, that recognized that, in certain contexts that there are harm, but freedom of speech should be the ideal. And that's kind of increasingly shifted towards a kind of progressive, a modern progressive definition, which essentially says that speech should serve the purpose of correcting systemic injustices, power imbalances, and structural inequality. And therefore, speech that is deemed by people that subscribe to that particular political philosophy that deviates away from that, then that should be censored, regulated, and so on and so forth. And I think many institutions essentially adopted that wholesale, particularly, a lot of, there are examples in the media, and this is where, to respond to your point about the Equiano project, we were founded in 2020 in the height of the kind of Black Lives Matter movement in the UK, because essentially, whilst discussions about racial inequality and racial injustice are incredibly important, we felt that ethnic minority-led organization, that discussions were increasingly narrow, that what it meant to be black within society in the US and the UK was defined essentially as a kind of victimized minority, and other conceptions of what it meant to be black were kind of marginalized and seen as a problem in some way. So the Equiano project was founded originally to broaden public debate and give particularly ethnic minorities a space to have a broad range of discussions about many of those contentious issues. And so I think that on that point of trust, I think that was partly a direct response to the media, which is ostensibly there to present a range of views, pursue the truth, and have that free inquiry, while actively shutting down and chastising a whole range of sections of people in society that were not racist, that were not malevolently intended, but did not necessarily subscribe to, perhaps maybe it might be defined as a kind of Ibram X. Kendi, a kind of idea that color blindness is a problem. So that's why the Equiano project was founded. And that's a lot of the work that we do, promoting public debate and having discussions like this. But I do think, and perhaps we'll come on to that if we were having this discussion a few years ago, that would be what I would primarily say was the problem, which was the narrowing of public debate and the censorious atmosphere and the kind of cancel culture that has been talked about. But I also think that we're also moving into another space where the backlash against those things is also creating its own chilling atmosphere, which actually can indeed be a threat to minority groups.
It's a lot to unpack, but I just want to go back to the view from minority communities, not a monolith, but what is the state of trust or mistrust when it comes to the minority community?
Yeah, so I think that, as all groups, they are diverse and heterogeneous. And I think that a lot of the distrust that has increased, particularly for minorities that support a colorblind universalistic perspective, for example, has been the sense that if you don't subscribe to a particular viewpoint on these issues, then your authenticity as a minority is kind of questioned. And you've seen that not just in the discussions around race, but I think gender identity was mentioned in other discussions or debates within the feminist community. And again, in terms of the media, I think they've often taken sides quite explicitly on these contentious discussions and chastised what are actually mainstream views, not just fringe or cranky or conspiratorial. And I think that's sown a lot of distrust, and even within communities itself.
Yeah. Ritu, can you tell us a little bit about the Quint, why you started it, why you think it was necessary, and how it relates to trust when it comes to media?
The Quint was born in 2015, and now it seems obvious, but at that time, what was clear was that consumption of news content was moving to handheld devices. What was also evident to us who had been in the broadcast space in news media before that as another entity, was that younger Indians wanted to engage and participate in the news and current affairs process, but that largely news media was addressing what used to be referred to as SECA, which refers to a certain level of affluence, male 40-plus audience. It was not speaking to women audiences or gender diverse audiences. and which is why the Quint was born back then, which is that the prediction then was that people will only be consuming content on handheld devices, that they would want to participate in the process, and you need to put out the news in formats and in a vocabulary that younger audiences will relate with and will engage with. And that's where we were born, and which is why, in India, we were the first to start crafting video for digital, sort of bringing in a new vocabulary even in digital. That was the idea. And we also wanted to bring in an element of citizen journalism, which is that we also wanted to be a platform where, of course, we would vet and verify, but you could also, as a member of the audience, as a citizen of the country, also raise the issue, and we would help you report on your issue, which we thought would also, and it's played out as that, which also helps build trust further. Subsequently, we also became...
Why is that? Why is it that if you have citizen journalists, it's going to help build trust?
Because I think...
and how do you make sure they're accurate, too?
So we have an entire team that works with the citizen journalists. So you actually do the ground checking. You verify the documents, you verify the claims, and very often the stories are not carried if we're not able to completely to verify that. I think the reason why I think citizen journalism, I think a lot of what happens on social media is also, in a sense, citizen journalism, but it is not vetted or does not go through editorial rigor. And we think that the reason why it builds trust is because very often news editors or sometimes reporters sometimes have that sense of entitlement on, we feel we know what should be news. Also, India is an extremely diverse, language diverse, culturally diverse country with very different issues across. So if you're sitting in New Delhi or in Mumbai and belting out what you think is news, you will tend to really, just constantly do the tip of the iceberg journalism, which is the most popular narrative. We've actually found that that the run order, so to say, or the choice of stories that you pick up changes so dramatically when a citizen is also engaged in the process. And what we find, interestingly, is that very often when we break a story, so to say, through working with a citizen, large legacy media or other news organizations pick up that story. And suddenly that story becomes an important story, which would otherwise have just not made it anywhere into mainstream news media.
You don't consider yourself mainstream media now?
I don't consider myself legacy news media because, I can hold forth for a long time on what's gone wrong with legacy news media in India. I don't know whether they want.
Well, you can let it flow. Go right ahead.
Okay. So, legacy news media in India, to start with, is the issue of the ownership of legacy news media. It's largely, almost entirely owned by a handful of large corporates, actually 2 large corporates mostly and a few others, who are allegedly also very closely aligned with the state. So that in itself sometimes determines whether
or not you trust.
Yeah,
Maybe?
Exactly. So that's one problem. The other problem is that news media as a business is very challenging. And if you're large, it becomes that much more challenging, right? And in India, a lot of large legacy media depends on government advertising for its bulk of its fuel to keep running, which means you then steer clear. If you look at broadcast news in India, you will see almost no stories, no reports. It's largely a platform for different political parties, largely the party or the regional parties that are in power. And they're just sort of 12 windows, and sort of the competition is who has how many windows on prime time, and there's a sort of slanging matches and debates, and it's pretty much the same 5 issues that are brought up in this very limited, very censored, safe space. So there is no And that is the paradoxically, large media is legacy media are the people who have boots on the ground. They have the wherewithal to go out and get the stories from the ground, but they're not doing that. And what has happened is that people like the Quint were referred to as the alternative, independent. It's extremely ironical that today you need to put independent and journalism as a special qualifier. Journalism should be independent, right? And so we were seen as people who were bringing in scrutiny, being critical of the government, asking uncomfortable questions, seeking accountability, and as a result of which there has been an attempt to bring a slew of new laws and new regulations in the country, which basically empowers the state to bring down content, to bring down an entire publication, and some of that has already happened. So, I mean, yeah.
No, and we're going to talk more about censorship, but before we do, David, you talk to readers all the time. You are hearing from readers constantly. Why don't they trust the Tennessean if they don't trust the Tennessean?
So I've been a journalist for the last 25 years, and I've seen these major changes over time. There's been a lot of disruption in our business model, in consumer habits, going from the print publication or broadcast to the mobile phone, for example, and who people trust as gatekeepers. And also, as I was talking earlier with one of our guests here, the fear of doom scrolling, essentially being assaulted by news because sometimes it's just bad news. So I think a lot of it is that. A lot of it is such a saturated environment, so people don't know who to trust. There's not the traditional 3 big networks, and the staffs of many of the major newspapers, especially at the local sites, are not as large as they used to be. So we've had a pivot. Some of us have, some of us haven't. I speak from a vantage point not only at working for the Tennessean, but also being a board member of the Tennessee Press Association. So I've seen numerous colleagues in rural areas in Tennessee who are struggling because they haven't adapted to digital as quickly as they should, and they don't have the resources or the wages, for example, for journalists to work a living wage, essentially. One of the
When you, I'm sorry, just to interrupt, when you get an email from a reader, what do they say about trust?
So when I usually get an email from a reader, 90% of the time it's, "You suck, why did you write that?" So essentially, but when I respond, usually
That's it? That's all?
No, usually a conversation starts because most people think that nobody is going to pay attention or respond to you. And I've made it a habit, as have many of my colleagues in Bennet, to be responsive, both on email but also in the physical space. This is one thing that I think to me is really important, that many of us have found this differentiation, at least at the Tennessean, is that we do a lot of events. I just returned from McMinnville, Tennessee, about 80 miles east of Nashville on Monday. I was there for my 7th visit in 6 years, moderating a forum, a political forum. There's a wonderful civic tradition in a very red community where Democrats and Republicans work together on forums. So I think one way you build trust is by being present, by actually showing up. And I keep on going back because they invite me and because it's important to show that we need to build this relationship, because we're constantly going to be fighting that trust machine. Who do you believe? It was mentioned earlier about the outlandish lie about Haitian immigrants eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. And yet people believed it. And you have to really counter that by being present where people are. I have dabbled a little bit, I'm sorry to say, in TikTok, and I've tried to find my own strategy for how do you reach an audience that has never read a newspaper before. Because when I go speak to high school students, they've never picked up a newspaper before. They may have read news, they think it's from somewhere, but they're not sure. But when they see, there's actually a commercial out there that I was a part of a cookie influencer. And actually this was showing the fact that we're relevant not just in the structures of news, but also in developing and supporting businesses. And it was received more than 7 million views. And people started recognizing me from the cookie commercial because I set up the Tennessean services of the community. Now, on one hand, it's not the traditional seriousness that people expect. But on the other hand, if we are not there present where people are, they're just not going to think about us.
James, I read a story recently regarding that talked a great deal about journalism and why people are turned off by legacy media, as Ritu brought up. And some of this discussion was about it's corporate, it's big business, they're out to make money. They don't care about anything but making money, and that's one of the reasons they don't trust the media. What do you say to that?
Let me come back to something David said, just to build on a point that he was making. Because I don't think we really have reckoned as a society with. We're all aware that there's been this wipeout of journalism nationally, but just how dire it has been and what it's done to kind of the civic culture, I think we don't fully understand. There was a study at Northwestern this year that we've lost a third of newspapers in the United States in the last 20 years, 2/3 of the newspaper journalists, that's 43,000 journalists who are no longer reporting out in their communities. And digital startups, non-legacy media, is not filling the gap. They're going out of business as fast as they're being created. So it's as we would say, it's a story about a dog that's not barking. So it's a hard story to tell, because how do you measure that in officials that haven't been held accountable, neighbors that didn't hear stories about their own communities that encourage them to have some sense of empathy for each other. And I think this has been a deep source, an important source in the collapse of trust in media, John, back to your original question, because it's robbed so many Americans of a journalism whose veracity they can verify with their own senses. They can drive down the street and see the construction project that is not being completed on time and know that it's been reported accurately in the local paper. And it's robbed national publications of journalists who came up being held accountable by a community for the accuracy, the integrity, the responsiveness of their work, whether they answered reader emails like David does and actually engaged with the community. And so it's been both in terms of what it's done to communities across the country and I think to consumers of news, because then what they're left with is big corporate legacy media, national media, and political leaders telling them, don't trust what those guys are saying. And who are you going to believe in that situation? And I think that's why there's been this just hollowing out of the news industry that I think has had devastating consequences for trust and has also undermined kind of the journalistic ethos. And I sound like a fossil when I start like a guy shaking his fist at the kids to get off his lawn. So let me cop to that. And while I'm here, but I think there was real value, and we have not figured out what the new ethos might be that could replace that would achieve similar levels of trust.
In a few years ago, we had fewer voices. Now there are more voices. But at the same time we have more voices, it seems like there's a deterioration in journalism. And you have any explanation for that?
So yeah, I'll pick up on that. But just on your point about whether it's big corporates that just want to make money. I mean, in the UK context, one of our largest media organisations is the BBC, which is publicly funded. So I don't necessarily think it's just a question of how media organizations are funded, whilst that undoubtedly is a big issue. I think this culture point that is a reoccurring discussion in all of the panels is key. And I think the remit of the BBC as a kind of publicly funded institution is a responsibility for impartiality. And that notion of kind of impartiality has come under huge challenge over the last few years, and which has bred a loss of trust, partly based off of the things that I talked about, this sense that there was a kind of elite opinion, and that was the only right, factual and moral way to think, and all those who deviate away from that, are a problem in some way. And actually the BBC have acknowledged some of their failings over the last kind of 10 or so years, I would argue are like partisan stances on majorly contentious issues in the UK, like Brexit, for example, or other issues that we've spoken about today. So I think that there is a kind of cultural challenge that a lot of these institutions are working in, and there's been a loss of confidence in many of these core liberal principles, and therefore an attempt to kind of grapple to find other principles that are dominant in society, and the zeitgeist for a long time has been that kind of progressive orthodoxy. So I think, that some institutions, some media organizations, impartiality, like the BBC, has also been an issue, even when there are alternative funding models there.
Ritu, does the Quint get lots of feedback about whether or not they think you're biased in one way or the other? I mean, do people say, you know, that story wasn't fair?
Yeah, I mean, you know, and it's a vicious cycle, right? It's, you know, I think there's overemphasis right now that everyone's putting on AI, and AI sort of feeding into confirmation biases or polarization. But actually, you know, if I was to take instance of India, political leaders speak out against independent media, or speak out against minorities, or even, you know, dog whistle from podiums against certain communities or certain independent-minded people. Now, when that happens, that actually triggers a certain keyword searches, right? So when those keyword searches, they lead to driving algos, and then you throw in AI to sort of put that on steroids. And that further polarizes, and it leads to, you know, further filter bubbles. And then what happens is that leads to further lack of trust. There's a lack of trust in what legacy media is doing because they're largely the mouthpiece of the government. But because legacy media is pushing one state-driven narrative, what happens to a lot of independent media, news media outfits, is that they are stepping into bridge a vacuum, right? There's stories that are not being told. Let's say the lynchings of minorities, or citizenship laws that are being brought in, which is going to make things even more difficult to minority communities, or just suspension of free speech, etc. Now, when that happens, there's a certain bias that creeps into that editorial as well. So it further polarizes, and then, of course, social media, algos, etc., further feed into that. And I think since morning today, a lot has been spoken about that. But what's also happening is what's happening to individual journalists, because, you know, a lot of independent news organizations, like he said, are either shutting down or cannot afford a certain seniority, or, you know, or pay journalists the way they should be paid. As a result of which, individual journalists have now set up their own YouTube channels or their own Instagram handles. But what is happening is that if anyone's being terribly critical, the government is either charging them with anti-terror laws. I mean, just if you're critical of the government, you can be a terrorist by just virtue of asking, you know, by just doing what honest journalism should be done. They're also charging us with financial crimes, money laundering, for instance. Of course, there is a slew of defamation cases. So now that works on two ways to undermine trust, because then as the average citizen says, oh, so-and-so is possibly a terrorist, so-and-so is a money launderer, so-and-so it has their own agenda. And that undermines, this discredits, apart from engaging people like us in litigation, it also discredits our journalism per se.
No, the chilling effect of that sort of action is really, you're into censorship now, and we might as well go ahead and talk about it, because this is a critical point. This is something that's happening in not just the United States, but all over. Excuse me. All over the world, and in many, many ways. So, David, let me just talk to you a bit about the state of Tennessee, the United States, the chilling effect that some action by the government is having on journalists. How do you see that sort of chilling effect?
Sure. One thing, for example from this year is the fact that the incumbent senator of the United States refuses to debate her opponent. And I wrote a column recently about Senator Blackburn. We had conversations over some time, and then they just went dark because they don't feel they have to. I mean, she's polling more than 20 points ahead of her Democratic opponent, Gloria Johnson, yet it's a lack of a public service in my mind, and I've spoken publicly about this. precisely because, on the one hand, yes, it's like a snub to the media, but it's also a snub to the public. And is it because they think there'll be so much apathy? I'll give you an example. MIT has an elections performance index. Tennessee ranked 51st out of states, all states, and DC in voter turnout in 2022. We have a voter turnout problem here, a serious one. The good news is early voting started yesterday, and we're exceeding 2020 levels. From a standpoint of journalists, one thing that we think about quite a bit when I talk to colleagues is that we need to do a better job of explaining our processes. American Press Institute came out with a study a few years ago showing that the same values that the average American holds are not necessarily reflected in the language we use in terms of how we talk about our ethics, how we talk about democracy. Oftentimes communities care about their communities, but they're not talking about it in the same ways that we are. Some of you may have seen that article from Ann Applebaum from The Atlantic about is Tennessee a democracy? And she was here on Vanderbilt's campus not too long ago talking about that very thing. And what created a very interesting counterpoint, an opportunity, because this is one of the things when we talk about censorship and cancel culture and so forth, we need to present multiple sides within reasonable and fact-checked viewpoints. But this week, our big debate is there voter suppression in the state of Tennessee? State Representative Jody Barrett, who's from the Nashville area, says there's no voter suppression. He comes from the GOP supermajority, where he believes that they've done everything right and that people can vote and people can't cheat. On the other hand, the president of the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Russ Wigington, says there is voter suppression and Tennessee's policies are keeping people from being able to access the ballot boxes they should. And in fact, a study from last week showed that Tennessee has the highest rate of felons, ex-felons being unable to vote and access their civil rights again. So we have to do a better job of telling those stories and explaining our process. Kind of a deviation just to a point of trust, every subscription, every page view is a point of trust from our consumers. And consumers oftentimes make a choice to go elsewhere. It's not that they don't want information. I often like to make the comparison that just because people don't buy CDs anymore doesn't mean they don't like music. People don't buy the newspaper like they did before because they're viewing news on different platforms. We have to reach them and we have to create value. We have to encourage people to pay for, in whatever way it is, whether it's indirectly through subscriptions or through public radio or so forth, through advertising, because this is the only way we survive.
Yeah. Just back to censorship again, James. We have a presidential candidate this year that's threatening to pull licenses from broadcasters, who's called the press the enemy of the people, lawsuits, threatening to arrest journalists. I mean, is there any way to measure the impact of that discussion?
That's something I would never be glib about, and it's something to worry about. I think just yesterday or the day before, he said he was going to straighten out the media. So we shouldn't minimize the potential danger of that. That said, so far, I don't think that's been the big problem. It could be in the future in terms of censorship in the U.S., and this is something that may be very different than in India, and I don't know about in the UK. I worry right now more about self-censorship and a culture of conformity that's come up in a couple of different panels here. That and I don't know if David French is still in the room. Probably not, but I know columnists and that it can be a problem. And I was an editor of columnists that. Who in this environment are reluctant to tackle certain subjects or advance opinions that would be regarded as heterodox or unorthodox for their particular tribe.
Like?
Because, as one of them once said to me, Twitter hates that, or X hates that because there's a sense of ownership that people have over the columnists that they like, the writers they like, and a sense of fear that I think a lot of reporters have too, that if they depart from the accepted narrative, if they challenge, it used to be different, and the old system had its problems too. I'm not by any means saying everything was great in the old days. I don't have that view at all. But there used to be rewards for being contrarian and unconventional. It's flipped in the last, and for the reasons we know, social media, and also, and I think this is a deep challenge for American media over time, the subscriber model itself. The whole idea of objectivity in media in the American context was a function of the business model of media, that as technology changed, as radio and then television came along and you were able to reach a large-scale audience that way, objectivity made sense because you didn't want to alienate vast swaths of the audience by seeming to have a particular political slant. It's a radical change in the way the American media, as it existed in the previous 150 years, tended to be small printers, very ideologically driven, appealing to a particular niche. The paradox of the internet is it has returned us to almost to a 19th century model. As the advertising model has collapsed and the platforms have sucked up the advertising, legacy media generally is more dependent on subscribers. Best way to get somebody to subscribe and resubscribe is to do something Renee referred to the other day, which is, in a sense, allow that person to identify with that person's chosen view of reality, their bespoke view of reality, and constantly tell them, I see the world the way you do, and not to challenge them. Not to disappoint them with facts that they will find inconvenient, and certainly not to hit them with arguments that they would find upsetting. And so that's, again, part of what I've come to think of as this sort of, it's a major source of the conformity that I think, and self-censorship that I think is the deeper problem right now in American media.
But do you watch the number? I mean, to get too personal, but do you watch the number of clicks on your column?
I don't now because I work at The Economist, and I don't. And we, it has a. I'm very grateful to be there. It has a real sense of poise and a real sense of its historic mission and purpose, and very strong editors. And so it's a little less affected, I think, by the vicissitudes of public opinion.
But the whole idea is obviously to get as many people to read what you write, correct? Are you measured on that?
This is the good thing about the subscriber model. It's less about scale. This is the positive side of it, and more about connecting with your subscriber base and your readers. And Economist readers expect a certain thing from the publication, which includes that The Economist will disappoint you by telling you things you don't want to hear. I don't think this is impossible stuff. I think you have to be in a constant, and David referred to this earlier, conversation with your readers, telling them about who you are, what you're doing, and flattering them, by the way, because my view is the readers can take it, actually. They just don't want to be surprised. And it rightly, people are smart. It rightly acknowledges that they're intelligent and they can handle it. But if you've trained your reader to expect a certain ideological slant, then they react very badly when you disappoint them.
Yeah. Inaya, can we talk a little bit about your concerns when it comes to potential censorship in the UK of media and chilling of free speech?
Yeah, I mean, it's coming from so many different levels, and I think, we've talked about government and, culture, self-censorship, and different kinds of things. I mean, one of the things that's been quite a big example in the UK over the last few years is there's been an organisation, a broadcast channel that was founded, that I used to work for, that was explicitly created with the intention of shaking up the broadcast media ecosystem, called GB News. And they were funded by advertisers as well as kind of big investors. And a big campaign was founded by a campaign group called Stop Funding Hate, which sought to target the people that were advertising on that television channel in order to pull funding, which was like a big funding resource for the channel there. So you see a kind of several kind of activist groups with a very broad remit with a term like hate, which is a very particular conception of hate that are essentially weaponized in order to shut down discussion. But then there's also a thing that has just been touched upon, which I do think is a important and I think worrying development that may well actually transpire even more concerning over the next few years, which is in the understandable kind of siege mentality and reaction that you feel when you have been essentially marginalized from the conversation. We now have essentially an incentive structure within, I think, particular new media platforms with the kind of echo chambers that have been talked about, where you are incentivized financially in order to perpetuate the views of your audience and in a kind of audience capture. And I think one of the things that we are seeing is, I think, the long and hard-fought taboos around extremism, racism, anti-Semitism, essentially increasingly be questioned and under challenge. So an example that I'll give is, and I'd be very interested in other people's thoughts on this, the Tucker Carlson case, where he recently interviewed an individual who claims to be a historian, questioning the dominant ideas about the way the World War II happened, and saying that the real villain was actually Churchill, and how we view Hitler, for example, is kind of unfortunate. And I think that in this context, I think this provides a very good example of also a lot of the dangers of this kind of unregulated media landscape, where you can kind of see a taboo and a tension within society, see that as an audience to kind of exploit, and then there's an incentive structure within new media landscapes where you can really ramp that up. And that was obviously amplified by Elon Musk to such a point where actually a journalist in the UK ended up asking a political leader, Nigel Farage, what he thought about this particular historical understanding. So I think there are big problems there as well, that something that we could otherwise think is just a niche fringe issue on the internet can actually have real world consequences and have a whole host of destabilizing effects around social norms. So there's these two things going on, a legacy institutional media, which I think has too often had a narrow conformity that has a disdain for mainstream views, but a kind of reaction as well where almost a kind of anything goes, where any kind of moral criticism is necessarily seen as a form of censorship or an attack on free speech. So I think there's multiple levels going on, which is effectively leaving the public less and less informed and less confident.
Yes, and Ritu, you talked about legacy media and the state influence. Do you get calls from government officials telling you they don't like your story and they want you to change it?
That would be the easy way out, right? But that would also boomerang on them, which is why what happens is that you're engaged or you're charged with all kinds of criminal or financial crime charges or terrorism charges, which are not about your journalism. So it's almost like there is no tamping down on press freedom directly. There's no one story that's being called out. So it's that would be easy, right? If
So do you feel pressure, that sort of pressure as well?
Yes, of course. Of course, when you're having to pay very expensive legal fee, you start sometimes choosing the battles you want to fight, and say which are the really important stories you want to be able to stick your neck out on. Sometimes those are decisions we take. But I'd just like to respond a bit to what James said, which is that while the reader revenue model is the ideal, and I think it's for a brand as strong as The Economist that has built trust with its strong journalism over years, I think the reader revenue model is something that can sustain strong, good journalism. But we know that reader revenue per se is plateauing, and most people like to pay for one outfit, which means large parts of the audiences are then left to the mercy of big tech algos and filter bubbles, and therefore are deprived of diversity of information or information integrity, which then impacts the way they vote. So I wish reader revenue was the solution, but unfortunately, it's not.
We're going to get a couple of questions here, but before we do, David, what sort of pressure do you feel from the state, from viewers, possible censorship in your job?
It's very interesting because this state, as you know, is very much about personal relationships. And even when you have an adversarial relationship with, say, the Speaker of the House or the governor, you develop an opportunity to talk to each other and trust each other. I've never felt the pressure from a politician to say you can't write that. A few years ago, we had a scandal with one of our former mayors, and I was the first journalist to call on her to resign. And while there was disappointment in that, it was something that I think was very important to do, from our part. So I've not felt any official, desire to do that. The question is, the big threats that we have from the state come in terms of legislation that affects especially smaller newspapers when it comes to their foreclosure advertising, baking notes, all these other things that are the source of their revenue, that are old school models in many ways, but they're what sustain them in small towns like Milan, Tennessee, or elsewhere. And this is something that's really critical that I'm very concerned, especially about the survival of small rural newspapers because they don't have the worker base, they've lost a lot of folks, and the advertising model simply doesn't work as it once did.
It's a huge concern. If you've got a question, you want to stand up with one of the microphones here. Hi, tell us your name, tell us what you want to.
Hi, I'm David Sullivan from the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership. I wanted to ask the panel about something that I think you've all alluded to, which is the move towards personal newsletters and the sort of substackification of the media, where you have folks formerly working for legacy media outlets, whatnot, moving to their newsletters, individual subscribers. You have, I think, some of the effects of polarization and sort of these kind of micro realities that people speak to, as well as the cutting out of editorial oversight that comes along with those newsletters. And it seems like a bit of a doom cycle, and I'm wondering, is there something we can do to get out of that, or how do we react to that?
Anybody want to take it?
I just want to say that, so I agree with a lot of the criticism that have been made about that. I mean, there is actually some interesting innovation going on as well in the UK. There is an organization called Mill Media who have essentially used the newsletter subscriber model as a way of reviving local media. So it's very localized to a particular area. They'll have, one journalist that is researching particular stories and doing, extremely great work in that local area. So it's niche insofar as it's obviously very specific to that particular area, but it's also actually providing a interesting innovation as a way of reviving local media as well. So I think that, again, that with a lot of things when it comes to the internet and innovations in the new media, it has its challenges as well as potential opportunities. So it's just our ability to work through those difficulties.
Just briefly, I think this is also a case for investing again in some legacy news organizations. For example, subscribing to the Nash Villager from WPLN, the NPR affiliate, they have high quality control, and that is something that is really effective. So when you have editors who are looking at something, or whether it's the Tennessean or whatever else it is, we have multiple people looking at this, and so that helps quite a bit to build that trust, and we also respond to the feedback.
There's a lot of great things about what's happened on Substack. I think I have a number of friends who are kind of heterodox writers who have found refuge and great financial success by becoming publications of one on Substack, and they're running their own successful subscription businesses because they don't fit in any one of the major tribes. Slight problem, they're creating tribes of their own in that environment, and as Ritu said, it doesn't solve the deep problem of where is the large-scale, high-quality news that's accessible and available to the society at large, and where is the thing like Nia described in the American context? There's no longer anything like the BBC, which serves as kind of the repository, the distributor of agreed-upon fact. And everybody hates the BBC, and everybody complains about the BBC, and all the other publications shoot at it, right? But it ultimately is seen as the truth, the truth teller. We could never, this is it doesn't already exist in the American context. We can never create anything like that. But I don't think we have a news organization that now plays that kind of function for us. And so Substack, while I'm glad it's employing a lot of good people and producing a lot of work, it also is, part of this kind of vociferous, fragmented media environment where every citizen can kind of choose their own adventure and their own reality, and I worry about that.
Yes.
Hey, I had a question about feedback. A lot of you talked about feedback that you get from readers, from the audience, and I also work in news, and I get a lot of feedback from my readers. I'm curious how you differentiate good faith versus bad faith feedback, and if you're comfortable with it, if you could tell a quick story of some good faith feedback that you received recently and how you did resolve that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a glutton for punishment, so I like to respond to just about everything, and sometimes it'll blow up in my face. But I just had a person who's been a constant critic of my work, thinking I'm too liberal on a couple of things, and then on a column that I wrote this week, it was a column related to why the Trump and Harris campaigns should not browbeat Black and Latino voters into voting for them. He sent me a note to say, I read that, and nobody should be browbeaten, and I agree with you. And you created an argument that was cogent and that I can agree with, and continue that conversation. And so it's an incentive to continue to talk. And our live events, I mentioned quickly, is a great place to connect with readers, where we get to see them, they get to see us, get to trust us, and feel that we will respond in a very earnest manner.
Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, my first career was in journalism, newspapers. It was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it very much. I am politically unaffiliated, and I don't look to news agencies to, tell me how to think politically. But I will say that I grew up with newspapers. There were 2 in my town, and my parents subscribed to both of them. And the younger kids in the family read the comic strip, all day, every day, or, every day. My sister and I would start reading Dear Abby or something like that. My brothers got real attached to the sports pages, and that stuck with them until adulthood, but it's, it's over now. If you want newspapers to survive, and I think a broad-based newspaper is a real good thing for a city or a region, you might consider recruiting people with more interesting features that appeal to them where they are. That's all.
Do you have a question?
No.
Okay. I think that I just wanted to go back to the newsletter for just 1 second, because I think in some communities, especially in local communities, they've become very popular when you lose your newspaper. But at the same time, and I read them, in local communities I've lived in. But I have to say, it doesn't fulfill the need. It doesn't cover the courts all the time. It doesn't cover the school system. It doesn't cover the city council. And I mean, David, you could probably talk about this more, but I mean, I'm sure that the Tennessean, as a larger paper, has tried to pick up the slack for some of those communities, but it's with fewer resources, isn't it impossible to do that?
It is. It's hard with the resources, but I'll tell you just a very quick story about how we have to address different readers' needs. And there are some readers who want deep information, but a vast majority of readers do not. They want basically the bullet points. Our data shows that. And last year was an example of that. During the mayoral election, we had 12 candidates running for office, and we had some deep questionnaires. We had, good traffic for it, but I kept on getting asked by people, who should I vote for? I said, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I created a scorecard comparing each of the candidates based upon their priorities, political affiliation, just 5 simple, and it was a hit. It gained us 200 new subscribers within a week. We essentially saw tremendous amounts of growth, and I realized we need both. We need the both and, where we serve the needs of the most loyal customers who want that in-depth work, but we can also, those people who prefer video news, and I host a video podcast, you have to find it in different ways. Unfortunately, you have to adapt in order to survive.
A lot of big topics we talked about today, and
Sorry,
a lot
if I
of
could come in.
challenges. Sure, we have 40 seconds.
Yeah, it's just to say that for us as well, we were sending newsletters and nobody was reading them because it was just something they would delete in their email. But it almost sounds like an ad for Substack. But with Substack, it's not just about what they read in the newsletter, which is obviously editorially vetted, but we've had the highest click-through rate to the rest of the content on the website, which means it's led to deeper engagement, and it's also led to the largest percentage of reader conversion to being paid subscribers. So it served a purpose.
Good thing. Yes.
It's the closest thing we've got to a magazine or a newspaper slip through somebody's mail slot is the email newsletter, and that's why everybody in the industry is filling your inboxes these days with this.
I'm just going back to your comment about the loss of local news and the concern, my big concern about that in this country in particular, that I think it's one of the big concerns we've got. Let's thank these guys for their insights.